For the sake of all beings, wisdom, compassion, non-clinging awareness. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Are there any observations or questions, things to be verbalized coming forward?
Could I move your microphone? It's going to drive me nuts. I can see that your glasses are knocking against it.
Yeah, please move it. Please move it.
Thank you. How does it work? I'll just go up a little bit higher up to there. And we should get...
These techie experts.
This would be very typically Tibetan, right? Because they say, when they speak about mantra, right, they suggest that, some people get very precious about the correct way to do mantra. And one time Kalu Rinpoche said to us, well, the correct volume to do mantra is if you were whispering a very dear secret to your shirt collar. Om mani padme hum.
Just what you're going to do.
So, any other observations?
Yes.
Yeah.
The other night I got engaged in fantasy building, which was very interesting, and kind of started with a thought that came out of the blue, which I then had an emotional response to, which then drove a kind of strategy making about how to manage if and when that situation arose again. And it started to take on a really repetitive cycling process, which was driven at some stage in that process by adrenaline, which kind of charged the whole thing up. And before I knew what, I'd spent quite a good deal of time very creatively making solutions to this imaginary problem. And it was going round and round quite fast. So I changed my posture and went and read Tilopa's song to Naropa and let the whole thing dissolve. And I'm pleased to find that I didn't thrash myself for having gotten into a thing, and didn't feel sort of like I was wasting my time or anything like that, but just that this arising had happened, and it was quite amazing to see its strength and power and buildingness. So I'm opening up to question how we create our realities, how we make our stories, how we perpetuate the sort of hallucination we seem to live in sometimes.
Yeah. It's a big question. And sometimes when we're just caught in the turmoil of doing it, then in that turmoil of doing it, it's so easy to never ask that question. For many people, it's in a sense the turmoil. It takes energy It's amazing, actually. It takes energy to sit there and plan and think and so on. And then now I'm exhausted. So then I go to sleep. And then I wake up and I'm feeling more refreshed. So I can have another look at that. Right? And then we die. I just kind of fast forwarded 85 years. Right? And you know, in a sense, that's being very crude. You know, I mean, it's hopefully it's never as simple as that. But that's how a normal life unfolds in our culture. You know, and in a sense, a lot of our counseling and therapy services that we provide for each other is to try and help people who are somehow lost the knack of doing that so that they can do that. It was a little bit like Freud saying something like his aspiration was to help people transform abject misery into common everyday unhappiness. You know? I mean, we can laugh, but and so there is I think it's a mystery, right? I mean, we're going to touch this word bodhicitta today. Maybe that's an attempt to kind of put a label on this ungraspable mystery so that we can sort of refer to it. But it's a mystery that some people find themselves with interest questioning how this works, and other people don't. Right? I mean, a strange thought came to mind. I have lots of strange thoughts, right? And you know, and I was thinking about my ancestry. Maybe it's because, you know, it was a birthday, and one does things like that sometimes at birthdays. And I was imagining a sperm from a being who today we name Neanderthal, right? Was swimming up kind of a fallopian tube of a Neanderthal, right? This is long before anyone thought of Homo sapiens. There's no Homo sapiens around yet. I mean, it's like early stage Neanderthal, right? Different species almost, you know. I mean, then you could even go one step further. They could fantasize this, and I'm thinking to myself, actually, that sperm swimming towards the egg, and that magical process whereby that particular sperm was accepted into that particular egg at that particular time, right? Probably with just kind of, if you could kind of look in with a cosmic microscope, which was big enough for you to see sperm and egg, but not, I'm going to say big enough, I mean, had sufficient magnification, but not sufficient magnification that the sperm and egg disappear, and what you have are vast ecologies of molecules, right? Like so, you understand what I'm saying? I mean, within a certain framework, I think probably we wouldn't know the slightest difference between that sperm and egg and the sperm and egg that happened in 1949 or 48, right? That kind of led to this. Right? And you know, and then the kind of forming of three types of tissues, you know, endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and the kind of enfoldings and things that are happening there in the at a level that's so small that we still can't really see it unless we had magnification, and then gradually growing into a tiny little kidney bean human, right, with a very fine thread kind of going off into the universe. It's almost like you had an umbilical cord that went to the moon. It's so far away because you're kind of so small and the womb's so big, right? Your mum's so big, and then gradually it's becoming more and more complex, and all these things are arranging themselves. And actually, I have a hunch that pretty much most of what I would see in the Neanderthal, or even in the chimpanzee, I wouldn't be able to distinguish between that and the journey of me. Consider this, and consider how, there's just like the whole system that we're talking about now is just completely engulfed in sunlight. Right? It's like we're swimming in a star. And the energy from that star is triggering photosynthesis in all kinds of beings, right, that seem to be very far away and nothing to do with chimpanzees and Neanderthals, but without which there'd be no chimpanzees and Neanderthals. Okay? And this is all unfolding together. Nobody's thought about going to the moon, and nobody's thought about the nature of mind. No one's invented bodhicitta, or no one's invented the Dharmakaya. These are inventions. They arose in a particular... I don't think, to tell you the truth, I don't think that bodhicitta exists in the world of greycoat. Right? And the Dharmakaya doesn't exist in even totality doesn't exist. Right? And then, it seems to me that most of what we are is manifesting in common with most of what everything else is. Like we're intermeshed, right? And then finally, you can imagine it's vast. It's planetary size, right? It's like it's a biosphere. I don't like to say biosphere because it's more than that. I'd rather say a planisphere. Right? Because the geology is flowing through the biology, right? I mean, without plate tectonics, there'd probably be nothing that we recognize either. It's like and then somewhere there's this kind of ephemeral froth of having a good think about something and figuring out how to solve the problem. Right? And it's kind of like a thin skimming, and you can imagine it's kind of shimmering on the outside like that kind of shimmer of color on a surface of a moonstone, or kind of an opalescent sheen on the surface. But the thickness of it compared to the mass, right, of a whole, we're talking about a distance of tens of thousands of kilometers. I'm talking about our planet, our body, right? And then you've got somewhere, I'm not sure if it's only a way of speaking on the surface. I mean, we can't really say where it is. Like where are those thoughts floating, right? But they're kind of a small part of it. And yet, right, that's pretty much the only thing that distinguishes me from all the rest of it. Okay? And in a sense, like the wonderment that somehow out of this emerges a being who cares, and a being who shares, and a being who's curious. And out of this emerges a being who sort of, I don't care, right? And doesn't share too much and isn't interested, right? And this is not of interest to the person who's not interested, but it's very interesting to the person who's interested, right? And so you have the possibility, the potential is there in the human being. This isn't to say you should do this, but it's just to say this does happen, not uncommonly, right? That this Neanderthal sperm and egg, right, has given rise to a being who is finding themselves compelled to be interested. You know, like I don't think you can choose to be interested. You know, I mean, I'm only interested as a kind of compulsion. You know, like I feel this like compelling interest, or I don't. Like I can't compel the interest. So, you know, in this sense, there's in the third Karmapa gave rise to a prayer, which is very widely used as a kind of a practice meditation in the Karju tradition, and it's to do with Mahamudra, and the in it there's this line which I'm finding increasingly potent, right? And it's like, may I learn the subtle teaching of mind practice. Yeah? And the sense in a way, like this whole sadhana is an encouragement for expanding an appreciation of learning the subtle teaching of mind practice, the subtle teaching of mind praxis, the subtle teaching of the total field of knowing praxis, the subtle teaching of the praxis of the total field of knowing. As Rinpoche once said, this is not mini mudra. You know, just right? It's maha, right? But it took me a long time to realize that it also meant that it's magnanimous, right? In a sense, by being interested in something, this is a gesture of generosity in action. You know, it's like you could make an argument, I suppose, that perhaps the only thing that you could uniquely give is your interest. Okay? And I mean, I don't think this is too wild or crazy a thought. I mean, I think lots of people realize that to meet with someone who displays genuine interest in what we're doing, right, is unfortunately a little bit rare sometimes. It's like a kind of very unusual gift. Any other observations or thoughts or?
Just a little noticing that, sometimes when I go to arrange myself, it seems that there's not much left to do. There's quite a lot of arranging that's already happened without my getting involved in it. And like it almost feels like my role is to just do a little bit of rearranging of some of the stuff that I guess through awareness I can see isn't working, or maybe it's become maladaptive, or just a habit that's not useful.
I think there can be a usefulness, right, to have a sense that our lives take place in collaboration with others. I think this is quite useful. Right, to think this, because I think it's possible, it seems to be possible in our day and age for people to not think that, to somehow think that their life takes place irrelevant of the collaboration with others. In fact, they maybe yearn for collaboration with others, but it's not happening. And And so if you take that image that I was creating, this huge unfolding of nature and life and so on, and this little, in a sense, this bit which is my add-on, my contribution. And to begin to have a sense that we are co-creating the universe of life experience as it arises for me. Because that's it. That's all I can work with, is the universe of life experience that arises for me. I mean, even if I say, yeah, but what about all the universe of experience that's arising that I don't know about? And well, that's arising for you, right? That's part of the universe that's arising for you is the universe that you know that you don't know about, but you're not going to worry about the one that you don't know that you don't worry about. You can only, this is, I mean, it's kind of so obvious, and yet it's actually quite, it can have a profound shift for people living in the culture that we're living in, because, this is again, Samantabhadra is, we could talk about Samantabhadra as a willingness to explore what is, and the strength of that willingness to explore what is in harmony with a confidence that that's all that is. There isn't anything else to explore. There's nothing left out, right? The what is what you're working with. And even if part of your working is like the idea that there's a lot of universe that you don't know and understand, if you were to look carefully, you would say that what is present right now is an idea that there is a lot of the universe that I don't know and don't understand, and that is happening now, that idea. Okay? And the thing is that this is the difficult to learn. It's called the subtle teaching of mind practice for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that it's very, very easy for human beings to kind of come very close to there and then kind of go off sideways and lose the plot totally. Right? And so, as we go on, well, the only universe I have to work with is the body-brain-mind community, constantly transforming body-brain-mind community web, right? That is the experience of that I live in, that I am, right? And then I subtly fall right off the wagon, right? By getting into a panic about, yeah, but what about others? Or, am I the only one in the universe? And, and you feel totally alone. The whole thing probably feels pointless and blah, 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 goes off like that. And yet, if we could somehow, that's why I say it's very useful to have an increasing confidence that our living is a collaborative creation. And you realize that each player in the collaboration is, from their perspective, and this is their perspective, in theory I can put myself into your shoes and kind of look in all directions as best I can. That's a really wonderful exercise to do, but it's still, I never get out of my shoes. It's still me thinking what you might be thinking, right? Or me feeling what you might be feeling. It's a heck of a lot better sometimes than the person who would never even imagine putting themselves into the other person's shoes, so you don't have a clue, right? But the idea that we could do that and that you're actually experiencing what they're doing has got problems. Right? And however, we can begin to see that, it takes a whole universe to make them. And it takes a whole universe to make this. And somehow there is this collaboration. And one of the difficulties with Buddhist teaching is not really a difficulty with Buddhist teaching. It's actually an inherent difficulty in learning the subtle teaching of mind praxis. Right? It's like, in other words, there's a difficulty in the very nature of what is. And that is that we have already, when we begin the path, wherever we wake up and begin to question, we're already embedded in a whole lot of relationships. And those relationships could be described as relationships of understanding, attitudes, like my shared attitudes and common understandings, like we're all working together to make Wangapeka and a lovely retreat center for the sake of all beings. It's a kind of a collaborative understanding there, right? Or we're trying to, get more candidates and so that the Labour Party can win with a bigger majority next time round. Or we're going around trying to convince other people that the Bible, according to the Jehovah's Witnesses, is the one and only thing. Like you have lots of, like a community of beings is a community of attitudes. It's a community of prejudices. You could put it that way. You could put it in a really positive way. You can put it in a really negative way, right? But it is kind of there. And so we meet with Dharma, we begin to question about life already embedded in our community of attitudes. And some of the communities of attitudes that we're embedded in are very general. And so actually I think you could find that Republicans and Democrats and agnostics and religious types, right? Generally speaking, all of them share the same prejudice, right, today, that the universe is made of stuff. And that, if you want to understand, then the problem is understanding how the stuff interacts. Whether it's atoms or people or institutions or what have you, right? We have got these things, right? And as soon as you've got a thing, you've got competition for space. I'm going to stand here. Shay says, no, I'm going to stand here, and pushes me off. Right? And so I said, no, I'm going to stand here, and I push you off, and we have this little shoving match. Right? And, only one thing can occupy the same space at the same time, kind of thing. I mean, this is the logic in terms of thingness, right, with this. And then along with that, and all of a sudden we've got a logic of scarcity. And well, there's only so much to go around, and you've got lots and I don't have much, so I want some of what you've got. And right? And so we get all the competition and fighting and jealousies and all kinds of stuff that can be happening there, right? And then out of this logic also comes a sense of, when we meet with the teaching, that there's a lot of suffering in this competition and collision and wrestling over limited resources. And I mean, there's so much more that could be said here, but that's enough, right? And so then you kind of conceive of the possibility. You have moments where you feel good. Just in ordinary sense, you feel good. And then compared to the moments when you feel bad, you're really fighting and wrestling all that, you yearn for more of this good, right? So you come along and you hear this teaching comes out, and they talk about dukkha, and they talk about samsara, and they talk about nirvana. And so nirvana is a better thing, right, that I want to get, right? I'm going to get to nirvana, right, or enlightenment, or however you want to describe this, name this. And so imagine for a moment, you spend some time, first of all, really looking deeply with genuine interest, right, into, just the mess of the suffering, right? And gradually you start to have theories about the cause of the suffering. This is not a Buddhist thing. This is just a kind of, you have hypotheses about it, right? It's caused by this, or it's caused by greed, or hatred, or delusion, or it's caused by socialists, or it's caused by right, black guys, or immigrants, or You know what I mean? We come up with all kinds of ideas which for us at that moment feel convincing. This is the best story I can come up with. Okay? The trouble is it never really works, because in a larger story we're all in this together and we can't live without each other. And so if we are living with us, if we're trying to use a story to get to peace, which means controlling others or getting rid of certain others and so on, we're just never going to do it, because it collides with this bigger reality, you might say, bigger story, shared collaborative story, right? Which goes, well, you know, you get rid of this and it's like cutting off, I'll solve my problem, I'll cut off my leg, you know. It's like the person who's got brain cancer, and so they go and have their head removed, and then they can run around and not have cancer anymore. I mean, it's kind of, you know, operation was a success, right? We got rid of the cancer, right? And unfortunately the patient died. And so imagine for a moment we come to a point where we begin to get insight into interdependence, interconnectedness. And then, of course, along with that, we start to hypothesize what is the inter part. And we start to conceive of things like energies and chi and karma. These are the kind of, we still, because we're really committed to things, we have to have a new thing to go between the things to explain how those things interact. Okay? But nevertheless, we're starting to see the things in themselves are not the whole story. We have to understand how the things are kind of interdependent, and when one thing changes a bit, others change, and so on. And this is a fantastic improvement, right? And not only that, but it feels exciting in your being, because it reflects, if you like, something of the larger unfolding ecology of mystery of this planet, which is an interbeing, right? An interknowing. Right? And in those moments when you're feeling very interested in this, you suddenly, one day you realize that when I'm interested, there's less suffering. I haven't solved any of the problems at all. The only thing that I've done is somehow replaced fear of the suffering or desperation to do something about it. It's been replaced with curiosity and interest, or some quality like that. And I haven't done anything about the suffering, but somehow my experience has changed. And gradually we get more and more tastes of a relative degree of cessation of suffering. It's like this is quite, never mind Buddhism, but can you see how this could be just an ordinary human thing? Right? And then you see, and of course some of you realize that we're paralleling the Four Noble Truths. And then we come to the Fourth Noble Truth, which is the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. Now, if I was to talk about the path to Tauranga, right, would it be possible for anyone to describe the path to Tauranga from here if no one had ever been to a Tauranga from here? Right? The path, right? The only way you see, you can know the path because, oh, well, I Google mapped it. You know, I did that, so Google told me, right? But actually, you don't know the path, the way to Tauranga, right? What you know is the idea of a way to Tauranga, and it may not quite work out. Okay? These people from Australia, of course, flew into Christchurch at 3 o'clock in the morning, where they had a pre-arranged car rental, which they insisted had a GPS. And they had to go in a hurry to Nelson from Christchurch. And it was a little car, you know, like a smallest car you could rent. And and so they set their GPS thing up for the shortest route to Nelson. And so they drove up to Hamner Hot Springs, and then they started going up on that road that goes up over the top, you know, like it's a four-wheel drive, you know, and there's big gates also, huge gates and everything that say, "Do not go any further, this is four-wheel drive territory only." And eventually they ran the thing up on a rock, you know, like with the wheels spinning in space, halfway up a mountain, and they sued the company, right, for getting them into trouble with this, right? And you go, because that wasn't the path to Nelson. Right? So actually you could say, well, the path to... you can't trust necessarily just because someone says this is the path, right? I said, didn't they look out the windscreen? I could imagine them driving along just looking at their turn left, turn right. And just like, that's really scary. Like I kind of, at least occasionally look out the window. You can't miss these huge signs. Right? So actually, you only know the path to Tauranga. You know the path to Tauranga if you've already been to Tauranga. Okay? And herein lies one of the massive problems of Buddhism and teachings of awakening. Because now many people who have walked the path to the cessation of suffering, right? They then, in that place of having walked the path, they're curious about how it all happens, right? They didn't, you see, we want to know what the path is before we do it. You see, well, how do I get to nirvana? How do I get to awakening? How do I get to bodhisattvaship? Well, you do this, you 4 of that, and 8 of that, and 16 of this, and then you do this, and you've got to study those 2 massive volumes I showed you in the precious treasury of qualities, right? And this is what you do. But the thing is, and then you say, oh, now I'm understanding Buddhism. You do this, and then you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this. But this is an understanding of the person who hasn't yet actually been to Tauranga. Maybe when you've been to Tauranga, you actually see the path is really different. It's uncanny driving with Kelvin. You know, if you're helping Kelvin go to a local place, because he's blind. A friend who's blind, and so, you know, he might. Well, could you drive me so and so? Well, yeah, sure, but I'm not sure where to go. Never mind, I'll tell you. So you drive along in the car. Okay, turn right. Now turn left at the next one, and it's like, what? Right? And you see, the path to wherever it is he's going is a whole sequence of different textural sounds that he feels in his body. As the sound of the tires on the road bounce off the tree and the lamppost and the sign and so on, have different qualities, and he can see that it's now turning. He's, oh no, you passed it. Go back. Remember that happened to me. It was like, oh, no, you just went past it. You got to go back. Okay? And so the knowledge of the path to the cessation of suffering, we're not talking about Google instruction. That's not knowledge. We're talking about the knowledge in your being. For example, there's a kind of knowledge in your being, hopefully, for you right now, that you're sitting with a group of friends in a grove, in the Kaimai, right, participating in a retreat. Right? This is not an intellectual thing. It's just kind of you. How do you know that? I don't want to get you all freaked out and, oh, how do I know? Maybe it's not real and so on. But, you know, just in an ordinary way, right? You could almost say, well, I know because I know. You know, but it's more than that. It's visceral, right? Your whole body is singing this. Your being, your thoughts are in tune with your physiology, you're in tune with your emotion. The whole thing makes a cohesive package that makes sense, right? There's a sense of functional connection of inner and outer in a kind of meaningful way. Okay? And so the sadhana of Samantabhadra is a bit like this. Right? Samantabhadra is a kind of code word for a quality of being that's already walked the path. Right? And now it's unfolding a deepening appreciation of how this path works, but not, why would you do that? You might do that because it could occur to you that by having a better understanding of how this path is unfolded might give you a way of more skillfully interacting with other beings so that your interaction with them can facilitate their path, right? Rather than trying to help them by saying, oh, well, just do my path. Okay? Because even if you're a, your master Buddhist teacher and so on, nobody awakens through practicing Buddhism. Everyone who awakens by living their own life. And so a kind of a deeper understanding of this. This is why we could perhaps not get out of the first two sections. Jeremy's going to be really pipped when we get to the end of these 3 weeks and we still haven't made it out of the second section. But, I question whether the Dharmakaya can jump out of the Dharmakaya. So we have this preparation work that we've talked about, and in a sense, you can look at this as preparation work in terms of, just a basic, very ordinary, get a good posture, establish a basic mindfulness, and then start to enrich and expand the views. But we could also see this as preparation work in terms of a recognition that my life is continuous gestation. And the act of gestation could be considered preparation for birth. And so from this point of view, we never stop preparation work, right? The next moment, what are you preparing for? The next moment, the next nano moment. In a sense, like the way I am now is the preparation for the next moment. So we could see preparation section as being a kind of an eternal, profound truth. We could also see it as being a kind of practical, helpful step-by-step. Do this first. Right? Because if I'm not comfortable and I'm not having a kind of appreciation, if you like, of the dance of body-brain-mind community in relationship with other body-brain-mind communities, it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to unfold the subtle teaching of mind practice any further, right? Without having this. And then we come to part 2. Smiling, breathing, present, appreciating, offering. That's the end of it. Okay? But then I thought I'd sort of expand from appreciating onward. Right? Smiling, breathing, present. Right? The sense of the smiling part, which comes up again and again through here, is introduced now. And the sense of not just I think it's important that we can encourage a sense that we are smiling, right? Because when I have a sense that I am smiling, it feels better than when I have a sense that I'm grimacing. So in a sense, that's there. But gradually we expand this, right? We think of it, in a sense, you've got the whole thing in the preparation. Well, what's the rest of the sadhana for? It's not then you go to this, then you go to this. You get in the preparation, and then you simply, without moving from the preparation, you kind of expand in all directions, in sensitivity and understanding. Right? It's like going to Mount Kailash without going anywhere. It's like you're just sitting in this kind of pristine stillness, right? In the midst of the flow of whatever is taking place, and there's an expansion. And so with this one we might begin to, could I perhaps find it useful to see a good functioning cell in relationship with another good functioning cell, so that they structurally couple and function together as a collective, is a kind of cellular level of smiling. If I was to compare this to a dysfunctional cell, or a cell that's unhealthy and not working well, trying to work with a functional cell or trying to work with another unfunctional cell, so that they're not structurally coupling, they're not talking together very well. They may be actually hurting each other in a way, right? And when I say hurting, I'm saying, in a sense, like undermining the ability of that cell to live well. We could say there's a smiling and an absence of smiling. Right? This smile, there's many levels there's layers and layers, smiles within smiles within smiles. What does it feel like when your ankles are smiling with your carpal bones, right, in your foot, right? Like what does it feel like when your thighs are smiling with your calves, right? When kind of this cell here is smiling with that cell. When the plaque on your teeth is smiling with the dentine in your teeth. Right? This is goofy, but in a sense, could we begin to go through all the different components that we are identifying as part of the interbeingness of this moment, and conceive of it's not just, then there's a smile stuck on it like a little plastic cutout smile on top of all these components, but each component is smiling. What would that mean? Right? Could you feel your forearms right now resting, and that the forearms are kind of a volume of smiling cells? And the whole of your physiology is a kind of a volume of smiling components. And I'm saying that because it just depends on your degree of magnification. If the components that you're seeing it are atoms, smiling atoms. Protons smiling with electrons, right? Atoms smiling with atoms, right? Making a illusion called a molecule. It's impermanent, doesn't really exist. Molecules don't exist. It's just atoms, right? But then atoms don't exist, right? It's just protons and electrons, but electrons don't exist, right? Da-di-da-di-da. Right? Or whatever level, right? Imagine good functioning is the equivalent of what we mean by smiling. We're talking about good functioning. Okay? That our heart is smiling with our lungs, is smiling with our adrenals. Right? Sometimes some of the organs are actually not smiling with each other. There's a kind of a dissonance of communication. This is so. In one sense, it feels a little goofy to me, talking about smiling this way, because it's so simplistic. But if it's possible that such a simplistic idea could become quite profound for you. It's become quite profound for me. Right? Like what would it mean for all of me to be present, right? All of me to be smiling with all of you. As you're looking at the monarch butterfly just lighting on the swan plant, right? What? And so you want the answer to that? Be still. Enter into the subtle, reciprocal learning, teaching, praxis of the field of knowing that is collaboratively bringing forth the world, the only world that I know. Smiling, breathing, presenting, right? And in one sense it's present in time, And in another sense, it's present as a gift. You know, like I presented, like a Christmas presented, right? It's like we have a sense of this, right? Smiling, breathing, present, with an expanding appreciation for the spacious, open, interbeing, interknowing nature of all experience. Feel the deep stirring of bodhicitta. Right? As we begin to open into this more inclusive interest in what is going on, it feels more spacious, right? I mean, we're not talking about entering into some space that's waiting there to be entered. We're talking about a kind of texture of knowing. Like you can sometimes you feel that your texture of knowing, is like there's not a lot of space compared to another day when it feels more spacious. And yet, some scientist comes along, what the hell are you talking about? And pulls out, I'll prove to you, this is ridiculous, you're deluded. And so they get an incredibly fine nano-scaled measuring device, and they measure your height and your width and thickness and mass and all this kind of stuff on a day when you're feeling spacious. And they measure it later when you're feeling not spacious, and it hasn't changed at all. So you're obviously just talking about a delusion, right? I'm not talking about a space that's kind of, could be measured with a scale like that. But we use the word all the time, and we used to use it a lot in the LSD days. Well, I'm really spaced, right? It's like a kind of a mental. It's a mental. It's a different dimension. Yeah, and yet it's very real to us, right? There's a feeling of spaciousness. Comes quite often. If it's just the right amount of spaciousness, it can be more easeful. I'm not so rushed. I'm spacious in time. Like I've got lots of time to do this. I'm not rushed. I'm spacious in space. It's not claustrophobic. I feel like I've got room to flex, right? But it's not so spacious that I freak out, right? With agoraphobia kind of thing. It's like, oh, it's too big, what am I going to do? Right? And so part of the subtle praxis is beginning to realize that there is no value in trying to push my sense of interbeingness into a place that's so vast that I freak out because it's so overwhelming, right? But by the same token, to have interest that just gently opens, smiling and breathing, a little bit more expansive than I kind of often live, feels very fruitful, because in that spaciousness there's a kind of openness, right? And that openness is like a door, right? A door's open, and when the door's open, you can go in and you can go out, right? So in other words, in this openness, I feel that I can engage with the world more because of that. I feel that openness, and at the same time, in that openness, I can receive the world more. It just depends on how you are. Maybe you're in a phase of the emphasis is more on your doing. You don't feel constrained, right? You're kind of, the door's open. I feel I can move. Some people have all kinds of gifts they'd like to give, but they don't have an opening to give their gifts, right? So just as we can confuse the space with the outer, we can confuse the openness with the outer, right? There's also kind of an inner sense of, things are opening up. And so the scientist comes in, I can't see anything opening, your mouth's still closed, your eyes are, right? But it's the way we speak, why? Because these are metaphors. And all metaphors ultimately are rooted in our physiological functioning, right? That's because that's a bottom line. We understand the world in terms of, we explain the world in terms of our prior experiences. And if you go back far enough, the only prior experience you have is physiological.
What, sorry?
Physiological. So we're with an expanding appreciation. And when I say appreciation too, I'm really meaning that not in the sense of liking it, right? But in the sense of, when I say, well, I'm appreciating the situation, it's more difficult than I thought, because I'm beginning to realize, there's this and this and this and this and this, and so that we can have appreciation without liking it. I don't really like it, but I appreciate it. Right? So I'm not saying I appreciate it like just merely I like it. Right? I can appreciate difficult situations and complex situations and so on. So with an expanding appreciation for the spacious, open interbeing, and this is probably a very useful term for our culture, right? Because you can talk about this lump being with that lump, and they're all interbeing. But if we explore a little further, we might begin to realize that if there's no responsiveness happening between two objects, right? If there's complete oblivion to the existence of the other object, you could say, well, the one object doesn't know the other object even exists. But if an object demonstrates a responsiveness to this object demonstrates responsiveness to that object, we could say, in a way of speaking, that this is demonstrating a kind of knowing that this exists. Okay? And so we might see that not only we're not just interbeing, but we are a world of interknowings. Right? This proton knowing that electron. Right? And we can then invent another thing to go in between, call it a weak force or a strong force, because we're really stuffed with this approach. Right? We're caught on a treadmill of inventing unending things, right? Because we don't yet, it's so difficult to make sense of just movement, right? Beyond description. Right? We talk about impermanence, but we don't know how to name, like impermanence and change, it's impermanent, it's like everything's subject to change, but we don't know what change is. We can only talk about the things as they are now, and then the things as they are a few seconds later, and then we assume some invisible thing called change took place. And yet, if you look at your experience, you remember things and you experience things as collaborative, flowing textures of sensation. We live in movement, right? Sperm swims up to an egg that's already moving. There's never not been movement. Huh? It's quite staggering. Huh? And in this movement, right, if we start to identify kind of clusterings of movements, and an observer can see things, an observer stands back and sees this clustering of movements is called a tarchin. And this clustering of movements is called a tree. Right? And then we could sort of talk about the tree interacting with the tarchin. But the place where the interaction happened was in the movement. Right? Our stories are so thin. Right? And so we could begin to see that where there is interbeing, there is interknowing. This is a very useful thing, even at the very beginning, to just play with and experiment with and kind of hold as a curious conundrum question. Because it might save you an awful lot of work later on, right? Because if you really get this and it makes sense, then you don't have the slightest need to ask how consciousness came into the universe. because there was never a time. It's a conscious universe. There was never a time when consciousness is just demonstrations of responsiveness, right? If there's no responsiveness, there's no knowing, and there's no universe for you. We're already born into a moving world of responsiveness, and we've conceived that we're trying to describe how this came out of a non-moving world, and yet we've never ever experienced anything that's non-moving. Because as soon as it becomes absolute zero is the place of rest, right? There's no consciousness there, right? All kind of physical processes that we understand have stopped. Huh? Smiling, breathing, present with an expanding appreciation for the spacious, open, interbeing, inter-knowing nature of all experience. Feel, explore, expand, right? A sense of the deep stirring, right, of bodhicitta, right? And you might say, well, what do we mean by bodhicitta? It's like, bodhi is like enlightenment, awakening, enlightening, right? Citta is a sense of heart or mind, or, you know, when you say, oh, I'm doing it with all my heart, has a sense of intent, right, of kind of direction, a yearning, right? And there's this, like, this is this compulsion that I was talking about, for being interested. It's a kind of a yearning for being. It's like it seems to be. What is it that swims that sperm in that direction? You know, generally speaking, more swim in that direction than that direction. I mean, there's really confused sperms. And by the way, you know, and this is like really popular, you see, like we know men are really confused and so on and so on. But you forget that every single woman began as a sperm. That I think we've forgotten in this dialogue. Right? It's true that every man began as an egg, and every man began as a sperm, but let's not forget that every woman also began as a sperm and began as an egg. And without being the living sperm, there'd be no women. Right? Now, it's just interesting, you know, like to kind of consider this, you know, and you're like, what is it that we've, I mean, I you know, don't necessarily ask these questions, but I find I do. You know, I somehow got bemused at the Royal Ontario Museum in the geology section, and they had this gigantic model of planet Earth at the beginning of the Hadean period. You know, and I was kind of intrigued at kind of big rocks all kind of clustering together and whirling around a star. It was kind of like amazing, like this great hot hellish inferno, and asteroids coming in and explosions, and like lots of explosions. I mean, like when you're a 12-year-old boy, you like lots of explosions, right? And coming in and everything, and then, you know, I'd walk around the Royal Ontario Museum and see all these other things, you know, like dinosaur skeletons and like different biomes that were being demonstrated and so on, and then sort of First Nation people and, you know, kind of so-called primal cultures and drums and totem poles and things, you know, and my mind would go like, how did this, you know, and the sense of evolution for me was a kind of a natural, right? That somehow there's a, like there's an oomph. What is bodhicitta? Bodhicitta is an oomph. Let's not get all terribly philosophical right now. We're talking about feel the oomph. Right? So, smiling, breathing, present with an expanding appreciation for the spacious, open, interbeing, inter-knowing nature of all experience. Feel the deep stirring of oomph. Now, of course, that for me comes in a Bodham, but yeah, this coffee company stole, it's like they could have called their coffee Bodhicitta, but they called it Huh? And you go, yeah, but I don't feel any oomph in my being. Because you go, oomph, it's okay for, the Dalai Lama has this great oomph, and Long Changpa had this great oomph, right, for awakening, but I don't feel like I have that, right? But here's the catch at this stage, right? Just see if you can hold the possibility that what you do feel of you is the oomph as it appears for you.
Just might not be oomphy enough.
You go, well, I don't like the oomph that I am. I want to be the oomph that somebody else is. I mean, those are kind of, we're playing, but I think there's something serious in here. Of course we get caught up in comparison and all that, and that's part of the challenge of, that's why it's a subtle teaching. Because you kind of look straight forward and then suddenly you've slid off into something else. You keep sliding off and losing it. We come back and again and again. If we could learn the subtle praxis of teaching of mind praxis before we died, at that moment of recognizing something of that, we would feel that our entire life was worth it. There's no kind of, oh God, I got it so late, what's the point now, Can hardly use it. Nobody's going to know I'm a famous yogi. Just And bodhicitta, there's so much that can be said here. I mean, just as that first one is like a hologram of fantastic amount of Theravadan teaching, the whole Theravadan teaching's in the preparation section, right? The Satipatthana and so forth, and basic mindfulness practice. And the whole Mahayana teaching is here, which is basically the teachings of bodhicitta. Yeah? And there's so many aspects that can be talked about, but that's to miss the point. It's quite fascinating, actually, to see how complex bodhicitta is, but you actually really appreciate it after you've, in a sense, worked with it for a long time. You look back. You're in Taranga and you're looking back, right? As you're going forward, you kind of you work with just however it appears to you, right? Never mind all these different teachings. And so sometimes it appears in a kind of absolute super-duper way, and the absolute oomph, the absoluteness of the oomph is that it's fundamentally ungraspable and unpin-downable. Right? And then some people took the next step, which was a dubious step, and called it empty. I say it was dubious because I think for many people the concept was sort of subtly misleading. Right? But when you try and grasp what's going on, you realize that what's going on is not separate from the very act of grasping what's going on, and it's like you can't quite grasp it. Right? So there's an aspect of bodhicitta in its kind of absolute sense, like if you really get it fully, right? We say, oh, shunyata. Right? And it's called absolute bodhicitta. And then we have also what we call kind of relative bodhicitta. And relative bodhicitta for me as a young aspiring Buddhist was the equivalent of second-rate bodhicitta. You had first-rate bodhicitta, was full realization of emptiness, and then you had second-rate bodhicitta, which, if you were lucky and you worked really hard for a long, long time, might get you to the real McCoy, right? And that was useful for me for quite a long time. And then gradually, I just couldn't get through it. It just wasn't, it was causing more problems than help. So I decided to change my understanding, right? Now, I'm just one of these types too. I have a compulsion to not fail, right? And Rinpoche taught me this really clearly, if we think life is a game, and you know, as a kid, many kids find out that there's two ways of winning a game. One is to become really good and better than everyone, and the other one is to cheat or change the rules. Right? And so I started thinking, well, maybe this is actually bodhicitta. There's bodhicitta in the realm of totality, right? From the point of view of totality. And then there's bodhicitta from the point of view of relativity. Both of them are the same bodhicitta, but one of them is expressed in terms of the inter-knowing, interconnected nature of everything. Everything's kind of relative. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's relative to everything else. Understand this? And yet, that very, and along with that comes a recognition it's collaborative. And it's not very long after that that you start to get things like compassion. Collaborative compassion, helpful, mutually collaborative. Right? And yet, if you were trying to grasp exactly what's going on, you couldn't pull this part out and say, this is what's going on, because nothing works without that and that and that, and in the end it's all ungraspable. Okay? And so we sometimes say bodhicitta is the kind of perfect inseparability of wisdom, the wisdom of realizing that all that I have to work with is the universe that is giving rise to me, and that this is fundamentally ungraspable, and compassion, right? That all I have to work with is a collaboration with everyone else, and I'm learning the art of doing this more skillfully. You know, the little froth in the teeny little participant. I'm a teeny little bit player, right, in this gigantic collaboration. And I, the bit player, right, can do my bit more skillfully or less skillfully, right? In other words, I can live in ways that support this awakening, right? Which always has something to do with compassion and helping and so on, right? Or I could do something that is obstructive to this, right? Maybe I think it's helping me, but it's not helping anyone else that I'm with. And because it's not helping the others that I'm with, ultimately it doesn't help me either, because bottom line, we're all in this together. So what is this, like this sense of, on one hand, you are a complete being. You are the universe of your experience, if you like. I don't like to say that because it seems to diminish it. It's, oh, well, it's your experience, as if somehow there's a bigger universe. It's just the universe. But if I say the universe and don't say the universe of your experience, you might think, well, I'm sitting here in the universe out there. But look around. You are the only person who has experienced the looking that you've just done. And there is no way that we can absolutely, with certainty, prove that the thing you see is the thing that I see. We can only get close enough, you know, like we can say, well, can you reach out your hand and touch that? And I can reach out, and so we agree. We're touching the same thing. Huh? But you can't prove it. It's just there. Actually, it's an act of faith. And so on one hand, we are this totality, and we might even begin to play with the possibility that everyone else is a totality as well. And simultaneously, and this is why there's a lot of work involved, right? We are a participant. And that kind of dialogue in my being, between being the being that I am and trying to be the being that I conceive that I could be, right, is the feeling of your life. right? It's like you're, it's like this is the way, the feel the deep oomph of bodhicitta, right? Like so I'm smiling, breathing present with an expanding appreciation for the spacious, open, interbeing, interknowing nature of all experience. Feel the deep stirring of bodhicitta. And another just attempt to hint at what we could mean by bodhicitta: a naturally evolving disposition for cultivating, both in ourselves and others, the magnificent human potential for panoramic, multi-realmed awareness and ceaseless compassion and love. Okay, and this for some people would be a complete yoga, a complete practice. It's enough just to, right? And then you kind of fall out of that, and then you realize that you're not in a strengthening posture, and you go back to posture. You're kind of like you've lost touch with body, brain, mind community, right? You're gradually learning the art of engaging with this and recognizing the liberative quality of interest, right? And developing the skills, learning. We are all of us learning the subtle teaching of life practice. Okay? You can't learn this from Tarchin or from the Buddha or from anybody. You only learn this from life, from living. And yet there's a lot of support that we can have each other in doing this. So I think that's as far as I want to go with this today. Are there any thoughts or things to express? Yeah.
Just I didn't quite understand one thing you just said a moment ago about feeling the being that you are, and something about that you conceive that you could be. I got a little bit confused, but very interested as well.
Well, I mean, I'll try and speak in even more conventional manner. You know, you have a sense of who and what you are, right? And sometimes that could be flavored with it's basically good, and sometimes you might have a sense that it's flavored with it's basically less than good. And you also probably have a feeling of like what you could do either with that goodness, like that feeling good of the basic goodness in your being is then what you're bringing to relation. You're not sitting there in your kind of isolated Buddha realization. You're in relationship with the world. You're sitting there trying to do your meditation retreat, right? And a bloody truck goes by, right? Or somebody starts banging the door, or somebody sort of parks themselves just outside the tree, outside your hut, and goes on the cell phone. You know, I mean, or a bird comes down, you know, shits on you, or you know. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a human doing something like a plant. You know, the time goes by, and the nice warm sunshine. You're now in the shade, and you're cold, and you have to put on a sweater, right? You live in a continuous transforming dance of relationships. It never stops. So, and what I can bring to those relationships is my sense of what I am. Sometimes my sense of what I am, right, is kind of enlarged and expansive, and kind of the whole of the universe, or our sense of completeness. You don't necessarily think about, oh, I'm the whole universe. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's kind of more partial and bitsy and what have you. And so this is what we can bring forward, and we're both of these. There's part of me which doesn't matter whether I'm in a good space or a bad space, I am the space that I am now. Right? And there is no could be. There's just this. But at the same time, you see, this is a problem that people get into in our culture. You know, it's got to be one or the other. You're either just this, or you're striving to get somewhere, right? So we consider this, oh, well, this stillness and movement have merged in the womb of the uncreated. I praise you, Mahamudra, all existence has your form. You know, we can understand stillness and we can understand movement, but we can't understand stillness and movement non-separate. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that we've got the stillness side sometimes, and sometimes we've got the completeness side sometimes. Sometimes we have feeling of incompleteness. Right? The incompleteness often leads to a sense of what I could do. I could run away, or I could dominate, or I could erase, or I could meditate, or I could, you know, I mean, we come up with responses, right? What I could do that would make it better, presumably. And then there's also, you're in a good space, and you're still interacting in the universe. And how are you going to interact? Well, you're going to interact somehow sharing the best of you, which might actually bring out in your mind the conception that there might be a best of them. Right? In a sense, like if the best of me is the sense of wonderment in a kind of magnificent collaborative universe, I might, total projection, sort of come up with the idea that maybe someone else would feel this is wondrous as well. Right? And so what I would try to do is I would conflict and I would force that being to see that it's a collaborative universe. No, that would be a total contradiction. Right? We have to learn a whole different way of relating. You know, it's kind of very gentle. It's like you didn't dare teach or even try and help someone. You've got to somehow conjure up skillful fabrication of a kind of environment of beingness that is compost and good food and nourishment for the garden of their beingness, whatever it is. So we've come up with quite a different idea, but that would come from already having a feeling of the goodness of the garden of your own beingness. And so it's not one or the other, you know, like planning ahead or just being. You're always, when I'm just being now, and this just being now is a lot of planning ahead. We have to learn to work with both of them. At the beginning, probably you work with the calm, the samatha, the tranquility, the stillness. And then you move with the vipassana and the investigation and so on. And gradually, and you have moments in between where you, oh yeah, the naturalness of them coming together and then apart again. And this is what we're working on, right? You're not working on a sadhana of Samantabhadra. You're not working on learning the Four Noble Truths or studying Buddhism. That's a conventional description, but it's not the feeling of the real juicy inner work. Was there something, kind of, if there's another flicker of someone, okay. Yeah. So I think we stop. By the power of these wholesome activities, may our lives be rich with awakening. Living thus, may we abandon all unwholesomeness. Right? In the midst of this endless, miraculous, ungraspable dancing, may we help. Sadhu.